Usually I try to open these videos with some sort of lead-in. I'm not gonna do that here. Instead, I'll skip straight to the point. Astlibra is one of the most interesting games I've played in a very, very long time. For better, and especially for worse. It's extremely unique, but it also has one of, if not the biggest fall-offs in any game I've ever played to date. Right off the gate, if you love, and I really do mean love, grinding in games, then you'll probably love this game as well. Otherwise, you'll probably come out like me, crying at the fact that it finally ended. I'm getting way ahead of myself here though, so I suppose it's time I explained myself. At its core, it's a 2D action RPG. An extremely niche genre, but one that I really like. Two more recent examples of the genre I can think of that I've mentioned before on this channel being Anno Mutationem and Eiyuden Chronicle Rising. This alone was enough to get me sold on this game after Steam randomly recommended it to me and I saw the trailer. More specifically after I saw the Revision version released in 2022 that serves as a sort of final update to what was originally a freeware project by a single salaryman that's been in the works for 14 years. I just want to note that just because the game was made by a single person, I'm not going to treat it less harshly than any other game. I believe that a game should be able to stand on its own regardless of factors like that. The game has a chapter structure, but for the sake of avoiding spoilers until the corresponding section, I will instead be referring to the first 6 chapters as Act 1, and the remainder as Acts 2 and 3, and the video segmenting will be done in the same vein. There's also a roguelike DLC named Astlibra Revision, but I haven't played it, and trust me, by the end of it you'll see I have no intention of doing so. I also won't get into the story specifics until much later, just because I don't want to get into spoilers, but the setup is as follows. The story starts with the main character, an unnamed boy, and his childhood friend Anulis attempting to escape their home village, as it's in the process of being destroyed by demons. The boy passes out and finds himself at the literal edge of the world alongside a talking crow that ends up calling itself Karen after the offer of a bunch of books that they found in the nearby hut, where they then start off living together before setting off on an 8-year journey looking for civilization and eventually the boy's hometown and childhood friend. Eventually he finds a magical set of scales that let him travel through time. Antics ensue. Before I really get into anything else, there's one big issue I have with this whole thing. Since the main character is unnamed, that means that every character always calls him things like that guy. It is really awkward and kind of takes me out of it, especially because the character does talk, he is an individual character, but you never actually see what he's saying when he's talking to other people. However, he does have a myriad of internal monologues, and trust me, you will see those a bunch. The combat in Astlibra leans much more into the action side of things than the RPG side, and it's pretty fun. Of course you have your basic attacks depending on the weapon type, as well as multiple character movement options you unlock throughout the game, like an air dash or the ability to backdash with iframe. This alone is fine, but then you get Karen. He's your secondary means of attack, as with him you can use magic, and that can be either buffs or attacks, and all of them cost a certain amount of stamina, and you accumulate stamina in combat by attacking enemies, creating a sort of positive feedback loop. Karen can also equip a bunch of passive skills, ranging from basic things like a run or a double jump, to being able to triple your damage in exchange for instant death on hit. The way you get these new abilities is by leveling up your gear and weapon. It either rewards you with a new skill entirely, or a magic crystal, which is what you need to equip them in the first place. The game constantly rewards you for experimenting with your arsenal and sticking with things that might not click with you at first. However, getting new gear in the first place is an annoyance in and of itself. You can't just buy them from shop. Instead you have to get money and materials for them both. You get the materials by beating up enemies or mining with pickaxes at certain locations. Pickaxes being items you have to buy. You can actually combine 2 items in your inventory at any given time, which is pretty important as all higher rarity chests dropped by enemies require either silver or gold keys, which you have to craft from resources as well. The issue is you can only craft what you have the recipe for, which is really annoying. This can get really grindy, and don't worry, we'll get to this later. This loop is consistent for almost the entire game. It's pretty great, all things considered. Progression in Act 1 is perfect. You go from getting your shit kicked in by regular ass slimes and hitting them with a stick to demolishing your enemies with giant weapons like they're nothing, while still having it be a challenge. But of course there's issues. First things first, some of you might have been looking at the footage and thinking, why does this game look like it's running at 5 FPS whenever you're in combat? And the reason is simple. This game overuses hit stun like crazy. Doesn't matter who hits what. If something takes damage on the screen, then the action will briefly come to a halt, paired with the honestly ear-grating sound effects that certain hits make, and it ends up being a complete slog. It makes the combat feel slow and sluggish as all hell. This is a problem because some weapons are slow and sluggish. Oh well, they can be. Much like in many RPGs, after getting a level up, you gain some skill points to distribute. Almost all stats do exactly what you think they would, with 3 key exceptions. Luck also increases the rate of money and EXP you gain, and speed affects your attack speed and weight both. See, every weapon has a certain weight attached to it. Some other equipables do as well. That value then gets averaged out with your agility/speed stat, and if the average is higher than 80, your weapon swings will be significantly slower. So you're basically forced to invest into speed either way. There's also adaptability, which is basically just swimming. Deus Ex has taught me to never spec into swimming, so I didn't. At the same time, the game does encourage a balanced build too, because if you invest too hard into a single skill, then you get diminishing returns. Thankfully, the game lets you respec your skill points for free at any shop, so you can experiment with any builds you feel like, which is pretty nice. I wish more games did that actually. There's actually also a secondary way to gain stats. Every time you kill an enemy, they drop these things called fours, which you can then invest into what is quite possibly the worst skill tree I have ever seen in my life. Navigating this thing is a nightmare, and since you can only travel along the pre-given path, which especially later on gets extraordinarily irritating, it can sometimes just become a genuine chore to use it in the first place. Unfortunately, this skill tree is also how you unlock new magic, and not using it is basically a death sentence. There's also a shortcut menu where you can place 6 utility items and 6 support items. Support items are basically just health items and the like, while utility items are the pickaxes which you need to map or else you can't use them on the field. This is also where you place things like ranged weapons, which are, in all honesty, kind of terrible. See, after you select an item, be it from the quick menu or shortcut, it has a wind up before being actually used. If you get hit during it, it interrupts the use. For health items and the like, this is great. It makes it so that you have to be on your toes at all times, and you gotta make sure that you can keep yourself safe while trying to heal up. However, when you're trying to use a ranged weapon mid-combat, it becomes a massive chore. At that point, the only use they have is for getting secrets in individual stages. But really, aside from Days issues, which might not even be that bad depending on the person, the combat is really solid, and easily the game's strongest asset. Unfortunately, Act 1 does have one other huge problem. Almost every single chapter here consists of mindlessly running back and forth between the same 2 areas repeatedly. It gets extremely annoying, since the enemies never change either. They also only respawn if you use a save point, and while that is pretty much the main issue of Act 1 in a vacuum, there's still several other cracks. I'll say this now so I can make it even more obvious later, but like I said earlier, this game is meant for those people who love grinding in RPGs. And I don't mean farming a couple enemies for 20 minutes and calling it a day. I'm talking taking hours of your time, be it for EXP or resources or new gear or weapon proficiency or even skill points, just grinding and grinding and grinding away. Though usually you'll be doing all at once, since everything loops back into each other anyway. Like being able to use the random drops from enemies to craft foods that can give you instant force. The reason for this is because the game just completely out of nowhere can and will throw insane difficulty spikes at you. A good example is the boss at the end of chapter 3, with the big culmination being in Act 2, which is nothing but an insane difficulty spike that you just really have to grind through, as you're not getting past it otherwise. Though, once again, I'm getting ahead of myself here a bit. And even then, it's still going to take quite a while to beat the bosses, because the biggest offense is the fact that the bosses in this game are extremely spongy. As a quick aside, before someone in the comments points this out, yes, the game in the footage is set to either normal or easy, depending on which will be more practical for me to get footage of, primarily because they are so spongy, and because lower difficulties have lower boss health, considerably in fact. And I just don't want to sit here wasting my drive space on 10 plus minutes of me fighting the same boss like I did on my actual playthrough. I don't have 12 terabytes free, sue me. Ultimately, it results in the same issues I have with games like Neo 1. You either completely destroy a boss or they do it to you. No in-betweens. Another pretty big issue is the way that status effects work in this game. There's really only 4. Bleeding, which damages you over time, paralysis, which slows you down, petrification, which makes it so you have to mash until you can move again, and poison. The first 3 are about what you expect and barely matter. But poison is just baffling. Instead of damaging you over time, it instead puts a death countdown on your ass, and when it runs out, you just die. The only way to cure it is by beating a boss, triggering a cutscene, using a really expensive item that cures all statuses, or reaching a save point. There is an antidote in the game, but you don't get that until late in Act 2, and even then it's pretty rare. The last real mechanic though is the Libra system. The magic scales aren't just for show, and you can place any non-equipment item in your inventory there, each giving you a different passive effect. The closer to balance the two sides are, the stronger the effect. It's a very cool system, but I wish it had more of a presence in the game. You'll realistically just be using it like once or twice and then forgetting about it outside of using it to grind more easily. The only exception is if you love min-maxing, which at that point, yeah, I can see why you would like this game. At the very least, the music is pretty solid and makes the grinding a bit more enjoyable. That is assuming the overabundance of sound effects doesn't drown it out completely. But even here, I do have some issues. See, as I said earlier, this game was made by just one guy, so it's understandable he would try to offload some of the work. Consequently, the entire game's soundtrack, and I do mean every last song, is royalty-free music made in the last 13 years or so. This alone isn't an issue. Plenty of games have done that before, and it can work very well. The issue stems from the fact that there's absolutely no tonal cohesion whatsoever. It often feels like the creator Keizo just downloaded a bunch of royalty-free songs at random and then just decided to stick them into places where they kind of sort of fit, and it doesn't really mesh well or even work at all sometimes, like just randomly cutting to rap music in some places. But if you can live with all of these issues, then hell, Act 1 is an enjoyable, albeit very grindy experience, and I would have gladly given it a 7, maybe an 8 if I was being generous. And then Act 2 happens. Once you get to Chapter 6, the game starts setting up that this is endgame. There is a clear sense of finality, and then you beat the chapter and it just keeps going. Fair enough. There's still a bunch of things that were left unresolved, but really this is where the game should have ended, or at the very least at Chapter 7, because this is where the game just absolutely nosedives. To avoid spoilers, I won't be showing any footage from Act 2 or 3 unless they visibly do not contain any. However, I will give as thorough an explanation on why I believe that these drop the ball hard as I can without spoiling anything. For pretty much the entirety of the first half of Act 2, several of your core gameplay mechanics are just taken away from you, and while you do get them back afterwards, that makes the entire chapter an absolute nightmare to play through, as the level design and especially combat and boss design are not adjusted accordingly. So you know what that means? Grinding. But it doesn't get real bad until the second half of Act 2, and onwards especially. The game has an absolutely insane difficulty spike here, where the only way to realistically get past it is, you guessed it, grinding your fucking ass off. The reason for this is that every single enemy at this point, but in particular the bosses, become absolute bullet hells. The only real way to deal with this is by blocking them with your shield, but let's say you're using a long weapon, then you don't have a shield, and if it breaks completely, well, you're just fucked. The only consistent way to deal with it other than that is by using Karen's Eliminate skill that allows you to destroy enemy projectiles with your magic, but this also means putting yourself into the midst of the enemy's never-ending barrage so you can land enough hits to fill up your stamina. This essentially forces you to disregard any magic skills you have been using up to this point in favor of ones with a large area of effect, so you don't get instantly killed by the 70 things shooting at you off screen that all feel like they have 4 million health up their ass. So once again, I grind it, and then after that it's just steamrolling the game again until you get cock blocked by yet another insane difficulty spike for absolutely no reason. Rinse and repeat until the very end of Act 2. The game even actively tells you to do this by going, yeah, there's a bunch of secret super bosses that you can fight, and really, you kind of should do that and grind those bonus dungeons out before you do anything here. This completely mind-melting cycle was genuinely beyond aggravating. I was actually streaming my playthrough to friends, and they can attest that they have not seen me this visibly frustrated at a video game since I last played Phantasy Star 2. It completely zaps any and all enjoyment out of the game and was genuinely beyond unenjoyable. Especially in a game like this, the answer should never be to either grind it out or stock up on so many health items that the enemies will just drop dead from the sheer size of your inventory alone. Oh yeah, that's another thing. If you die at a boss, it's extremely inconsistent. Sometimes you get sent to the last save point, sometimes you get the option to restart the entire fight, and sometimes you just have to redo the phase you died at. The latter two, however, do not restock any items you used on your failed attempts, so it's entirely possible to just run out of health items like that. That's fun, isn't it? Because at that point, you might as well just grind your health items out as well. At this point, you're basically just grinding for the sake of it. If you're not grinding for EXP, then you're grinding for money, or for resources, or for weapon EXP. You're always just fucking grinding and grinding and grinding and grinding, and it's beyond infuriating. And it's really not gonna get better from here on out either. At least on higher difficulties, you get more of everything. You get more EXP, you get more money, you get more force. The higher the difficulty, the higher the amount. But then that adds a whole other layer of issues with the fact that the bosses are now even spongier, making everything take longer anyway. So really, you're not fixing the issue with this. It's just so fucking frustrating. If you wanna just grind like this, go on a farm and do some physical labor or some shit. And then Act 3, on the other hand, is a complete joke in comparison. The difficulty instead falls too hard into the opposite direction. The game now becomes too easy, as the majority of Act 3 consists of revisiting old areas, and the enemies there are now wholly underpowered, barring the exception of a few that have been powered up here and there, but not by much. It's primarily the bosses that have been changed. It's almost like the game is begging you to speedrun it at this point, and it actually starts becoming kind of fun again. And then, right at the end, they fumble it one last time. The final dungeon is a series of 4 randomly generated layers, with 6 floors each, that you will be forced to repeat over and over and over and over again, because you see, to get the true ending, you need a certain amount of a certain resource. There seems to be conflicting information on how many of it you need, but I know for a fact that I used 14. You can get 2 of them in the main 2 acts, and 1 from beating every very last arena challenge. The remaining 11 you have to get here. You can get 10 consistently and without much hassle, but the last has to come from a random drop in this dungeon, and it doesn't matter how hard you try to maximize your chances of getting it. No matter how high you get your luck stat or what ornaments you equip, the drop rate will be pathetically low. It genuinely took me the better part of 3 hours to get a single one, and that's considered lucky. You can actually miss out on the 2 instances of the item in the first 2 acts and end up having to grind even more. I cannot imagine how absolutely draining this must be on someone. To put it into perspective, when I went into this endgame grind, I was level 60. By the time I was done, I was level 80. That's a big jump if you ask me. And then, finally, there's the big elephant in the room, the story. From here on, there will be spoilers. But the TLDW is that I think the story is extremely stupid and riddled with inconsistencies and plot holes. If you would like to hear my clarification, stick around. Otherwise, skip to the segment on screen to avoid spoilers. I think that playing this game right after reading the Muv-Luv trilogy was one hell of an experience, because the structure of the plots are way more similar than I could have ever anticipated. Minor Muv-Luv spoilers here, but skip to the time on screen to avoid them. If the main 2 acts are Muv-Luv Unlimited, then the postscript is alternative. While the former is about a random guy being thrust into an unfamiliar world, forced to adapt and slowly seeing the world around him fall apart, the latter resets them into a time loop where they use their prior experiences to achieve a better outcome. This isn't particularly unique to either, but it leads me to a point of complaint that I do want to make. Where in Muv-Luv, the new timeline and alternative comes with its own unique and unpredictable consequences and changes that force the main character into new, foreign situations, Astlibra's postscript completely undoes all the sacrifices the protagonist makes throughout the first loop, and he never has to try to make another. Whereas in the first 2 acts you have unavoidable consequences everywhere, postscript saps all of that away, and instead replaces them with the new threat of an alien invasion that just doesn't go anywhere. And while there are some interesting plot twists, it becomes extraordinarily predictable. I believe time travel narratives to be extremely difficult to pull off, and while I like the idea of the scales in theory, the way the plot uses them is extremely inconsistent, especially in the postscript. For instance, after you help the heroes defeat the Demon King in the first act, in the past, that completely undoes all of the bad things that happened in Elisa's village. However, those same events were the ones that led to the gang getting the boat with the shield relic on it to begin with, that was the one that let them go to the Demon King's castle in the first place. But now, even though that never happened, they still have that boat with the relic. Another one is the end of chapter 8, where Karen once again disappears and then just gets shoehorned back into the plot by being a version of himself from an alternate timeline that was sapped over. The game even acknowledges the inconsistencies in the postscript, but that alone doesn't fix them. You can't just acknowledge an issue and hope like that works it. I think the biggest issue, however, is the fact that the game just doesn't know when to end. First, it fakes you out after chapter 8 by booting you back to the title screen and making you load your game up again. Then it does the same thing after chapter 9, and only after the postscript does it actually end. I know a lot of people argue that the postscript is actually just a post game, but I don't think you can call it a post-game when it directly continues off where the main game, quote-unquote, ended and contradicts what the ending was, as it was all just a dream in the first place and the actual narrative is still going on. If it was just that, then sure, it wouldn't be so bad. But the fact that the game during the first act repeatedly sets chapters up to be endgame is just so infuriating. First chapter 6, then chapter 7, then chapter 8, and finally 9. And with each one, the impact grows lesser and lesser to the point where I was repeatedly thinking to myself, when is it finally fucking over? When is the game finally gonna wrap up its bullshit? I don't think I've ever audibly yelled, "I'm finally done," after beating a game before, because every single time I felt like the game had reached a satisfying conclusion, it just kept going and going. The worst part of it is that once you do get to the postscript and have to retread everything from the start, it essentially just makes it very clear that in the first 2 acts, nothing really happened. You're basically just building everything up to making one big choice between having a girlfriend and having a cool bird bro, and then repeatedly changing your mind, because goddammit, if you can't have both, then you will have neither. Doesn't matter anyway, because in postgame you do get both. I think that's what really angers me about the postscript. It gives you and the characters a way out that makes everyone happy, while the first 2 half repeatedly hammer home the idea that making a deal with a god and abusing their powers is gonna come with a price. And then they just handwave it away with having the goddess herself take on all the consequences. I actually ended up charting out my overall enjoyment of the game in both story and gameplay over time, and funnily enough, they drop off and rise at the same points. The more and more ridiculous the plot twists became, the grindier the game got. And while I do, as I said earlier, think the postscript does a lot to get the narrative back on track, it just ends up making the entirety of the first 2 acts feel hollow. Maybe I'm just too cynical to appreciate a simple, everyone gets to be happy ending, but I just wish it felt a little more earned than it ultimately did. I also really find the whole Anubis project thing extremely fucking dumb. The demons being reanimated corpses and whatnot is fine and all, but the way they try to explain it with mind time travel and information transfer into the past to all of this ridiculous nonsense and these inconsistent rules that apply only to this one part of the world, which, how does that even work? And then trying to justify it all with the chaos bullshit in the postscript just really doesn't help. The gameplay kind of does the same kind of bullshit. I mean, seriously, leaving several core mechanics like upgrading your gear up until the final 2 chapters of the game is just ridiculous. It also makes it so that for the first 2 acts, not every weapon is viable. Meanwhile, in the postscript, early game weapons somehow end up being better than the late game weapons because you find a lot more charts for them and half of them are incredibly overpowered. I don't know what the thought process was there. And thus concludes my little rant about this game, specifically its narrative, and also some special gameplay additions in the final act. Ultimately, I can safely say that I personally wouldn't recommend this game to anyone, but I can say one thing for sure. Even though I didn't like this game much, I see an immense potential in the core mechanics of it, and I do think that if they refined them and fixed the grinding issues, there could be potential for an incredible sequel here. But as it stands, this is definitely the kind of game that will really resonate with a certain kind of people. I'm just not one of them, and so I can at the very least respect its existence, even though I really didn't enjoy it. With that said, I seriously need a break from thinking about this game and getting angry at the second act. So, I wish you all a wonderful morning, day, evening, or night. I'm gonna go take a shower.